June 4th, 1943. The railroad tracks. Mexia, Texas. The pencil trembled slightly in Unificia Vera Burkhart's hand as he scribbled in his secret diary. Words that would have earned him a special invitation to rot in a cell if his own officers had discovered them. These Americans are definitely tricking us. What kind of God-forsaken country could possibly possess such prosperity while fighting a war on two fronts? Through the train car window, he witnessed something that completely contradicted 3 years of brainwashing by the pathetic Nazi propaganda machine. Brilliant electric lights blazed from every farm, every street corner, every shop. A boundless galaxy of light stretched across the Texas plains at 10 o'clock at night. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940. Even before the war, rural electrification had reached less than 20% of German farms. And yet, here in this place, the Nazi propaganda machine, described as a decadent, collapsed America, electricity flowed like water. 1,850 veterans of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps stepped off the passenger train. Not cattle cars, not freight cars, but plush Pullman cars with dining service and sleeping berths. The entire population of Mexia had poured into the streets to witness their arrival. What none of them knew was that this moment would ignite the most profound psychological transformation in the history of modern prisoners of war. A systematic demolition of Nazi ideology through the sheer display of America's terrifying industrial might. The arithmetic for Allied victory wasn't written in battle plans, but in the production statistics that would soon shatter every assumption these soldiers held about their enemy, their homeland, and their pathetic ideals. The unraveling began on May 13, 1943 in Tunisia. Generaloberst Jürgen von Arnim Rommel's replacement surrendered with an estimated 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian troops. The number varies as scattered units continued to give up for days. The Wehrmacht's most battle-hardened desert warriors, the men who had pushed the British all the way back to Egypt, the men who had earned the grudging respect of Montgomery himself, were suddenly prisoners. Among them was Hauptmann Friedrich Radke, a holder of the Iron Cross First Class, a veteran of the French campaign, twice wounded in North Africa. His diary, discovered decades later in the National Archives, has provided historians with the most detailed account of the psychological impact of American captivity on German soldiers. The journey from defeat to disillusionment began at the port of Oran, Algeria, as Radke and 30,000 other prisoners waited in makeshift camps to board transport ships. The sheer efficiency of the Americans began to crack their preconceptions. The U.Z. Army processed thousands of prisoners a day with an organizational precision that far surpassed anything the Wehrmacht had ever achieved, even at the height of its power. ID cards were photographed and filed, medical exams completed, inoculations given, and their rights under the Geneva Convention explained in fluent German by American officers specially trained for this very moment. But the first real shock came from the food. Sergeant Hans Mohr, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later, "In the cage at Oran, while we waited for the ships, the Yanks fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of fighting in the desert. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda that they were trying to impress us. We had no idea this was their army's standard ration." The Liberty ships that would carry them across the Atlantic were themselves monuments to American industrial might. The SS Robert E. Peary was built in just 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes at the Kaiser Shipyard in Richmond, California. A truth that, if known back in Germany, would have been dismissed as fantastical propaganda. These ships, produced at a rate of 3 per day at their peak, were on their return voyage after making deliveries to the European front. Instead of sailing back empty, they carried human cargo up to 30,000 prisoners of war per month in the summer of 1943. The 2-week Atlantic crossing in July of 1943 delivered the second stage of their psychological deconstruction. Corporal Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Infantry Division documented it in meticulous detail that survived in letters to his family after his repatriation. He noted that the ship's crew threw away more leftover food each day than his entire company received in a week's rations during the final months in Africa. American sailors tossing half-eaten steaks, entire loaves of bread, gallons of milk that was a day too old. Zimmerman wrote, "They did this openly without a second thought, not to mock us, but because to them this waste was meaningless. Their supply was infinite. The ships themselves became floating classrooms in American might. The prisoners discovered that the ship carrying them was just one of 2,710 Liberty ships that would be built during the war. Each one required 250,000 parts, assembled from components manufactured in 32 different states. The engines, they learned from chatty American guards, were built in 3 separate factories, each churning out 900 horsepower cylinders that were then assembled at ports that had only existed for 2 years. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, whose Prussian aristocratic family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, later wrote in his memoirs, "As our ship approached the American coast, I observed the rotating radar antenna on the bridge. This technology, which we believed only we and perhaps the British possessed in limited numbers, was standard equipment on a cargo ship. It was then I began to suspect that Germany had perhaps already lost this war." August 2nd, 1943, Norfolk Naval Station, Virginia. The first glimpse of America shattered the last remnants of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. The Norfolk base sprawled over 4,300 acres, its piers stretched for miles, its cranes unloading dozens of ships simultaneously. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than the entire port of Hamburg, Germany did in a week. Private Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before being conscripted, counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading or unloading. Each crane, he noted in his secret diary, lifted loads that in Germany would have required a dozen men and horses. They moved with electric power, smoothly, continuously, without the coal smoke that choked our industrial cities. The prisoners were lined up and marched to waiting trains. Along the way, they passed parking lots, filled with civilian automobiles, hundreds of them belonging to the dock workers. In Germany, private car ownership was still a privilege of the rich and the party elite. The Volkswagen promised to the German people since 1934 remained a propaganda pipe dream with fewer than 1,000 delivered to civilians. Here, ordinary labourers drove their own cars to work, but nothing could have prepared them for the trains. Not boxcars, not the 40 and 8's 40 men or 8 horses that had ferried German troops across Europe, but fully appointed passenger cars, Pullman cars with upholstered seats that converted into sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery. Observation: cars with panoramic windows. Hauptmann Radke wrote, "We boarded as tourists, not as prisoners. The American guards seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant apologized that the air conditioning in our car wasn't working perfectly. Air conditioning. In August, we believed such a luxury existed only on Hitler's personal train. The 3-day train journey from Norfolk to the camps in Texas and Oklahoma would prove more devastating to Nazi ideology than any military defeat. As the trains rolled through Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces to the windows, witnessing an America that simply could not exist according to everything they had been told. Every small town was ablaze with light. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, communities where in Germany a single electric streetlight would have been a marvel. Here displayed brightly lit storefronts, electric signs, and houses with lights burning in multiple rooms. The trains passed factories running night shifts, their windows glowing, their parking lots still full even at midnight. Sergeant Murr, whose father was a Nazi party block leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered in 1987, "We passed through dozens of cities on the first night. Each one had more electricity than all of Hamburg combined. The guards told us this was normal, that every town in America had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just shrugged and said, 'We would see.' At Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. The prisoners watched American railroad workers accomplish in 30 minutes, a task that would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automatic coal loaders, electric water pumps, mechanized lubrication systems, every aspect of the operation screamed technological superiority. Even more disturbing was the casual wealth of the workers themselves. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles, and tossed the empty ones into a bin without a second thought. They chain-smoked cigarettes, stubbing them out when they were only half finished. Corporal Hinrich Müller, a pre-war Siemens electrical engineer, calculated that the single platform where they stopped used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in a day. "The waste was magnificent," he wrote. "They left lights on in empty buildings. Electric fans ran in unoccupied rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resources." As the trains passed through Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners were confronted with the full display of American industrial might. Through the windows, they saw an endless succession of factories, each larger than anything most of them had ever seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 miles along the river, its electric furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the trains slowed as they passed the Rubbertown complex, where synthetic rubber plants had sprung up from empty fields in just 18 months. 4 massive facilities, each employing thousands of workers, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite having invented the process, had never produced more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Lieutenant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, understood instantly. In a post-war interview, he recalled, "I knew those plants. I could see the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each facility was more advanced than anything we had built, and there were 4 of them in this one location alone. They told us there were dozens more across the country." The trains passed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, visible from miles away. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled the bombers from 1,550,000 parts, supplied by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant covered 2.5 million square feet of floor space and used more electricity than the German city of Cologne. Captain Verley, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face to the window as they passed. He counted 17 B-24s in various stages of completion visible from the train. "We had been told that American planes were inferior, hastily built, that they would fall apart in combat. But I could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of the construction. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply being built faster than we could possibly imagine." The deeper the train went into America, the more complete the collapse of their Nazi ideology became. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge, while below, barges carried more grain than Germany's entire 1942 harvest. The prisoners could see grain elevators stretching along both banks of the river, each holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Petty Officer Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote in his diary, "The Americans move food the way we move ammunition, with endless quantity and no concern for loss. I watched them load a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with a slice of meat thicker than our weekly ration." In Kansas City, the train stopped at a massive stockyard, where tens of thousands of cattle awaited slaughter. The smell of the meatpacking plants hung in the air for miles. German prisoners who had survived on 200 grams of meat per week in Africa, when they were lucky, watched American workers eat beef hamburgers on their lunch break. "They eat meat like we eat bread," wrote Private Paul Fisher. "No, that's wrong. They eat meat the way we wish we could eat bread." A guard bought us hamburgers from a stand near the station. Meat, cheese, vegetables on a white bun for 15 cents. He bought 20 of them without a second thought, paying with a single dollar bill. This was not a special occasion. This was their normal food. The arrival at the prison camps brought the next level of cognitive destruction. Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months, housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions that surpassed what most of them had ever known as civilians. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heating. Each building was constructed with more lumber than entire villages in Germany contained. The camp hospital astonished the medical personnel among the prisoners. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. X-ray machines, surgical equipment, pharmaceuticals that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941. It was all standard issue for enemy prisoners of war. They had penicillin, Dr. Bauer would later testify, the miracle drug we had only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for lack of basic sulfur drugs, and the Americans were giving us their most advanced medicine without hesitation. The camp kitchen became another classroom in American prosperity. Prisoners assigned to kitchen duty discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automatic dishwashers, and gas stoves capable of preparing meals for 5,000 men. The daily rations included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, in quantities German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. Sergeant Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, wrote, "Today, we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply surplus. American regulations required us to prepare 10% more than was needed to ensure every prisoner received his full portion. The excess was disposed of. I wept as I threw perfectly good loaves of bread into the garbage." By September of 1943, American agricultural labor shortages led to the use of prisoners of war in fields and factories across the country. This decision, driven by sheer necessity, proved more devastating to the Nazi ideology than any propaganda program could have ever dreamed of. Groups of prisoners were trucked daily to work sites, driven through the American heartland with no blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything. Endless fields of corn and wheat, factories running 3 shifts, stores overflowing with goods, parking lots packed with cars, homes with refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin outside Houston, NCO Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in an hour than his entire village could in a month, using traditional methods. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned the gin was nobody special, Lang noted. Not an aristocrat, not a party member, just a farmer. And yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car and a tractor. His workers, including the black men, ate lunches from boxes containing more food than a German worker received in a week. And this was normal. Every farm we passed was like this. In Nebraska, prisoners working the sugar beet fields witnessed an agricultural mechanization that defied all comprehension. A single combine harvester, they were told, could do the work of 100 men. The fields stretched to the horizon, each one larger than an entire German district. The farmers spoke casually of yields that were pure fantasy back in Germany. 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 on its best land. Private Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm outside Scottsbluff, wrote, "The farmer's son, a boy of 16, drives a tractor worth more than everything my father has earned in his entire life. When I mentioned this, the boy just laughed and said it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father was waiting on a new, better model from John Deere." The most devastating revelations came to those prisoners who worked near or in American factories. Although the rules of the Geneva Convention forbade direct war production work, POWs could work in industries that freed up American workers for military manufacturing. This convenient little loophole allowed thousands of German prisoners to witness American industrial might firsthand. At a Campbell's soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners observed production lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than most German plants handled in a month. The facility ran with a skeleton crew of women and old men, as most of the younger workers were in the military. And yet, production exceeded peacetime levels. Master Sergeant Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war, documented the experience. Everything was automated. Electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, autoclaves that processed hundreds of cans at once. A single elderly woman monitored controls that would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while listening to the radio and drinking coffee. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant caught glimpses of the automotive industry's conversion to wartime production. The River Rouge complex, visible across the river, employed 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatt-hours of electricity per day, more than the entire city of Hamburg. We could see the parking lots, Corporal Franz Kellner wrote. Thousands of cars belonging to the workers. Workers in Germany, even our officers, rarely owned cars. Here, the factory workers drive to their jobs. The guard told us many workers owned 2 cars, one for work, one for the family to use. We thought he was mocking us. By the winter of 1943, the cumulative effect of these observations had created what American intelligence officers dubbed ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoners. The Special Projects Division, a secret re-education program run by the Provost Marshal General's office, noted a rising number of prisoners requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Noland, a member of the monitoring team, reported in December 1943, "The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They have seen too much. The most fanatical Nazis have fallen silent. They remain loyal to Germany. But they no longer speak of victory." Many openly questioned the absolute nonsense they had been brainwashed with about America. The camp newspapers, produced by the prisoners themselves, began to reflect this shift. Der Ruf, the Call, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually shifted from defiant nationalism to discussions of democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. The editors, carefully selected anti-Nazi prisoners, found their audience increasingly receptive. Second Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter passed by American censors, "We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of military effort. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were told fairy tales by a bunch of criminals. The most brutal blow to Nazi ideology came from an unexpected source. The treatment of Italian prisoners after Italy's surrender in September 1943. Italian POWs who agreed to cooperate were formed into Italian service units, given better quarters, increased pay, and more freedom. The German prisoners watched as their former allies worked alongside Americans, ate in American diners, some even dated American women. Hetman Friedrich Schultz wrote, "The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better than we treated them as allies. They work freely, earn money, send parcels home. The Americans show no hatred for them. This democracy we were taught to despise seems more honorable than our own system." Christmas of 1943 delivered the most profound psychological blow of all. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners of war. The same enemies who had been trying to kill American soldiers just months earlier. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Local communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinner, though regulations prevented most from accepting. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in German for the prisoners. The women of Hearn sent over homemade cookies and cakes. The Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. This kindness to an enemy shattered the last remnants of the Nazis' pathetic racial theories. Lieutenant Walter Müller, whose own brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting our army. Yet they show us Christian charity, not propaganda, but true goodness. What kind of people treat their enemies like this? Only those who are absolutely certain of victory and utterly confident in their own strength." The Christmas feast alone was enough to boggle the mind. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream, an amount of food Germany hadn't seen since before the First World War. The prisoners ate until they were sick, unable to believe such resources could be squandered on the enemy. "We ate like kings," wrote Sergeant Hanser, "better than German generals ate, better than the party leaders ate, and this wasn't some special occasion. The guards told us this was a normal American Christmas dinner. that every American family was eating the exact same meal. If this is what they feed their prisoners, what in God's name must their own soldiers be eating? By early 1944, more than 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs. They learned English, American history, mathematics, and sciences. The University of Chicago offered correspondence courses. Stanford University sent professors to lecture on democracy and economics. The thirst for knowledge was insatiable. These prisoners, brainwashed to believe Americans were uncultured barbarians, discovered libraries with millions of books, universities that welcomed all social classes, and world-leading scientific research. They were free to read American newspapers, to compare different viewpoints, something unthinkable in Nazi Germany. Captain Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "The American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without a trace of hatred. They spoke of science as something universal, belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of German research, and they shared their knowledge with the enemy. This spiritual generosity was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi ideology. The camp theaters showed American films, not propaganda, but regular Hollywood productions. The prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, seeing a depiction of American defeat and recovery that resonated with their own situation. They watched The Grapes of Wrath, astonished that the Americans would dare to display such self-criticism to their enemies. They hide nothing," wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. "They show their problems, their failures, their conflicts. But this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such criticism meant death. Here, it was considered patriotic." The spring of 1944 brought expanded prisoner labor programs as American production reached its zenith. German POWs worked in canneries, mills, and factories, witnessing the full might of American industrial capacity. The numbers told a story no propaganda could refute. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded steel for the landing craft of D-Day. They watched in awe as workers assembled 700 boats a month, each requiring 20,000 parts. The factory employed 20,000 workers, including thousands of women operating cranes, welding hulls, and managing production lines. Staff Sergeant Kurt Zimmerman wrote, "Women doing men's work, black people operating complex machinery, teenagers running drill presses. All things we were taught were impossible in a decadent democracy. And yet the production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. They produced more boats in 1 month than our entire Navy built in a year." At the Republic Steel plant in Ohio, prisoners witnessed the production of 10,000 tons of steel per day. The blast furnaces ran continuously, fed by endless trains of iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The scale defied German comprehension. This single factory produced more steel than the entire Ruhr region at its peak. "I worked at Krupp before the war," wrote Corporal Paul Hartmann. "I thought I understood industrial production, but this was beyond imagination. The amount of steel they simply spilled was more than we could hope to produce. The workers complained about overtime while producing quantities we couldn't achieve even with slave labor and double shifts." The summer harvest of 1944 delivered the final, crushing blow to Nazi propaganda about American weakness. German prisoners worked across the Midwest, witnessing an agricultural output that could feed the world. In Kansas, they saw wheat harvests where a single farm produced more grain than an entire German province. Combine harvesters moved across the fields like ships on a golden ocean, each one clearing 100 acres a day. The grain silos they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in an entire year. "An American farmer with a machine does the work of 100 German farmers," wrote Corporal Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia. "They showed me aerial photographs of the wheat fields, thousands of square miles of grain. They could lose half their crop and still have more than all of Europe combined." In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards that stretched to the horizon. They stared in disbelief as perfectly good fruit was discarded for minor blemishes, fruit that would have been treasured in Germany. Sometimes an entire crop was plowed under to maintain prices. a concept that was psychologically devastating to prisoners from a nation ravaged by starvation. "They destroy food to keep prices stable," wrote Private Otto Schultz. "Mountains of oranges were bulldozed into pits because they had too many. We begged to be allowed to send them to our families in Germany. The guards were sympathetic but explained it was impossible. That waste was a strategic demonstration of their endless resources." June 6, 1944. When news of the Normandy landings reached the camps, the German prisoners experienced their final ideological collapse. The scale of the operation, 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 troops in the first wave, demonstrated an organizational capacity beyond the wildest Nazi dreams. Prisoners at Camp Shelby saw newsreels of the invasion within days. They saw the endless lines of ships, the artificial harbors, the supply system moving 15,000 tons of material per day across open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed by the very nation they were taught was too soft to fight. "We knew then that everything was lost," wrote Friedrich von Tauben. "Not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the greatest industrial power on earth with fairy tales and ridiculous racial myths. We brought our horses against their trucks, our rifles against their automatic weapons, our courage against their endless resources." Throughout their captivity, the German POWs experienced something that challenged Nazi ideology more than any material wealth: American humanity. Despite propaganda depicting Americans as weak and decadent, the POWs discovered a people confident enough in their strength to show mercy. When Private Hans Miller's son died in the bombing of Hamburg, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered his condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups sent her food packages in Germany. The civilian enemy in a country America was actively bombing. They separated the German people from the Nazi regime, wrote Captain Otto. They said they were fighting Hitler, not the Germans. This distinction, which had seemed like propaganda, was proven true. They were preparing us to rebuild Germany after the war, not to destroy it. The medical treatment was particularly affecting for the prisoners. German doctors worked alongside American medical staff, learning new techniques, using advanced equipment. Prisoners were given surgical care that in Germany was reserved only for the absolute elite. Mental health treatment, something virtually unheard of in the Wehrmacht, was provided to psychologically scarred soldiers. Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote, "They treated suicide attempts with counseling, not punishment. Mentally broken prisoners received therapy, not beatings. This humanity towards an enemy revealed a strength we had never understood, the self-confidence of true power." By March of 1945, the secret re-education program was yielding impressive results. More than 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for courses on democracy. Camp newspapers published articles on constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated the future of post-war Germany. The program's success exceeded all expectations. Prisoners who had arrived as fanatical Nazis were now penning essays on democratic reconstruction. Officers who had once sworn a blood oath to Hitler were now planning to apply American agricultural methods in post-war Germany. "We became missionaries for democracy," Ost Hermann Göring, no relation to the portly Reichsmarschall, admitted in a 1975 interview. "Not through force or propaganda, but through observation. We saw it work. We saw ordinary people living better than the German aristocracy. We wanted that for Germany." The transformation was so complete that American authorities worried the prisoners were becoming a little too enthusiastic about the American way of life. Some requested to stay in the U.S. after the war. Others married American women they had met through prison pen pal programs. Thousands would eventually immigrate to the U.S. In the 1950s, April of 1945, brought the final crushing truth. As American troops liberated the concentration camps in Germany, footage was shown to the German POWs. Many initially refused to believe it, dismissing it as propaganda. But the evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, and finally, letters from home confirmed the horror. The psychological impact was devastating. The men who had clung to some shred of pride in Germany's honor, despite military defeat, now faced the total moral collapse of their nation. Everything they had fought for was not just defeated, it was pure evil. Captain Walter Schmidt wrote the most eloquent summary. "We thought we were warriors for a great cause. It turns out we were just tools for criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to lesser peoples. It turns out we were the savages. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization actually means." When the war ended in May of 1945, the German POWs faced repatriation with mixed feelings. They had eaten better as prisoners than they had as soldiers. They had been treated with more dignity by their enemies than by their own government. The final months of captivity were spent preparing for their return to a ruined Germany. American authorities provided vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction. The prisoners learned about the Marshall Plan before it was even announced, understanding that America would rebuild, not punish, Germany. "They prepared us to rebuild our country," wrote Ostfriedrich von Tobin. "They gave us skills, knowledge, hope. They turned defeated soldiers into future citizens." This generosity from the victors was simply incomprehensible to minds molded by Nazi hatred. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German prisoners were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a Germany that was divided, devastated, and destitute. But these guys brought back something priceless. They brought back the knowledge of how a democratic, industrial society works. These former Nazi prisoners, having tasted American prosperity, unwittingly became the agents of change for post-war Germany. They had seen with their own eyes industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity, and the opulence of a democracy. They knew reconstruction was possible because they had seen a society that had already mastered it. Many former prisoners rose to prominent positions in the reconstruction of West Germany. Hans Krohn, a prisoner at Camp Shelby, became the West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who had taught at Camp Como, became the president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Weckmar, held at Camp Herne, served as Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. Eduard Ackermann, a prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a leader in Germany's agricultural reform. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built in part on the knowledge gained in American POW camps. "We learned that prosperity comes from freedom, not from conquest," Hans Krohn wrote in his memoirs. "We saw that democracy creates wealth, that diversity brings strength, that treating workers well increases production." These lessons, learned as prisoners, shaped a new Germany. Historians have called the German POW experience in America one of the most successful re-education programs in history. Without coercion, without traditional propaganda, the sheer force of American industrial might and democracy converted hardened fascists into future democratic citizens. The program worked because it relied not on words, but on observation. The prisoners saw an American society operating at peak efficiency, while still treating its enemies with dignity. They witnessed an industrial capacity that made German production look primitive and backward. They experienced a standard of living that exposed the Nazi promises as the hollow fantasies they were. Dr. Arnold Kramer, a leading historian on German POWs in America, concluded, "America won the propaganda war not with clever messages, but with brutal reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every flushing toilet was an irrefutable argument against fascism. The prisoners of war were converted by prosperity. The statistics bear this out. Of the 371,683 German POWs held in America, less than 1% attempted to escape, with only 2,222 incidents recorded. Post-war surveys showed that 95% rated the treatment they received as good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war. In 1985, on the 40-year anniversary of the war's end, surviving German POWs held a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners returned to the U.S., many bringing their families to show them where their transformation began. Former cavalryman Hans Waker, who was held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later returned to become a doctor in Georgetown, Maine, spoke at the reunion. Life in the camps was a vast improvement for many of us who grew up in cold water flats in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food. But more than that, we discovered human dignity. Former Sergeant Kurt Meyer, who worked on farms in Iowa, added, "The farmers treated us not as the enemy, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their knowledge, and sometimes their homes with us. This humanity came from men whose own sons were fighting against us. This changed us forever." At the 1985 reunion, former Panzer crewman Hermann Gut, then 78 years old, gave a keynote speech that captured the essence of the transformation. "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We witnessed the arsenal of democracy operating at full capacity. We saw farmers producing food for the world, workers creating the tools of victory, and citizens treating their enemies with dignity. We learned that America's true weapons were not bombs or tanks, but its endless ingenuity and unshakable confidence. We returned to Germany with a mission to build a society that could create rather than destroy, a society that could prosper through peace instead of war. The Germany that rose from the ashes was built on the lessons learned in America's POW camps. We, who came as conquerors, left as students, to America from your former enemies. And now, friends, thank you for showing us the way." The entire hall erupted in thunderous applause. Americans and Germans together, former enemies united in recognition of a transformation that seemed impossible when the first trains rolled into Texas in June of 1943. The magnitude of the German POW experience in America can be measured in stark statistics, revealing both the scale of the operation and its remarkable success. Camp infrastructure. Over 500 camps across 45 states, every state except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. 175 main camps, with 325 branch camps. Camps were built to hold from 250 to 12,000 prisoners each. Construction was completed in an average of 90 days per camp. Prisoner numbers: 371,683 German POWs, part of a total of 425,871 Axis prisoners. The population peaked in May of 1945, an average of 20,000 new arrivals per month in 1943, 30,000 per month after D-Day, and 60,000 per month in the final months of the war. Labor contribution: 14 million man-days of agricultural labor, 100 million board feet of lumber processed, a labor value of $230 million in 1940s currency, 80 cents in wages per day for a prisoner. Prisoners filled critical labor shortages in 46 states. Escape statistics: only 2,222 escape attempts among more than 371,000 prisoners, or 0.6%. There were no permanently successful escapes. Most escapees were recaptured within 24 hours. No American civilians were harmed by escaped POWs. Education programs: over 40,000 enrolled in educational courses, 135 camp newspapers published, 30,000 participated in English classes, 15,000 in vocational training, and distance learning university courses for 8,000. Post-war immigration: approximately 5,000 former POWs immigrated to the U.S. after the war. Over 12,000 maintained correspondence with American families. The average length of correspondence was 31 years. Many returned as tourists or business partners. Treatment ratings: 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. 74% believed their time in captivity positively changed their worldview. 61% expressed an interest in learning about democracy. Less than 10%, still held strong Nazi beliefs by 1945. The German prisoners who experienced America's industrial might didn't just witness history, they were transformed by it. Their captivity became an education, their defeat became an enlightenment, and their imprisonment became a liberation from the ideological chains of Nazism. In the end, America's greatest victory was not on the battlefield, but in the prison camps, where the overwhelming evidence of a democracy's prosperity accomplished what armies could not: the complete ideological conversion of the enemy. These prisoners arrived with a belief in German superiority and American weakness. They left knowing the truth. America's industrial might wasn't just overwhelming, it was incomprehensible to minds shaped by scarcity and brutality. The trains that brought them to their captivity in 1943 carried the warriors of the Third Reich. These prisoners arrived with a belief in German superiority and American weakness. They left knowing the truth. America's industrial might wasn't just overwhelming, it was incomprehensible to minds shaped by scarcity and brutality. The trains that brought them to their captivity in 1943 carried the warriors of the Third Reich. The ships that returned them to Germany in 1946 carried the architects of a democracy. They had seen the future, and it actually worked. Their story is a testament to a profound truth. The most powerful weapon in America's arsenal was not its military might, but the simple, overwhelming proof of a free society's ability to create abundance. The German prisoners of war were stunned by America's industrial power, but they were ultimately converted by it. In their transformation lay the seeds for post-war Europe's redemption and the ultimate failure of the Nazi dream. They returned to Germany not as defeated enemies, but as witnesses to what free societies could achieve. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s was built on a foundation laid in America's POW camps, where the enemy's soldiers learned that prosperity comes not from conquest, but from freedom, not from racial supremacy, but from human dignity, not from totalitarian control, but from democratic cooperation. The German prisoners came to America expecting to find a weak, divided, and collapsing nation. Instead, they discovered an industrial giant of boundless strength and surprising humanity. They arrived as prisoners of war, but left as witnesses to the arsenal of democracy at its absolute peak. In their astonishment at American abundance lay the psychological seeds for the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and Germany's democratic reconstruction. They had seen America, and they would never be the same. Their children would grow up in a democratic Germany, allied with the United States of America. A partnership built on the transformation that began when 1,850 veterans of the Africa Corps stepped off a train in Mexia, Texas, and discovered that everything they had ever believed was a lie. The story of German POWs in America is ultimately a story of redemption through enlightenment. It proves that sometimes the greatest victories are won not by destruction, but by demonstration, not through propaganda, but through prosperity, not by hatred, but by humanity. The German soldiers who witnessed America's industrial power became unwitting ambassadors for democracy, carrying home the seeds of a transformation that would later blossom into one of history's most successful reconstructions. Their journey from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens remains one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history. This achievement was not accomplished by force, but through the undeniable proof of what free people can achieve when they work together. That, in the end, was America's secret weapon. Not just the ability to produce more tanks and planes than any nation in history, but the capacity to turn enemies into friends through the simple power of example. The German prisoners of war were stunned by America's industrial might, but more importantly, they were changed by it. And in that change lay the foundation for a better world.